Israelites about how he shattered the first set of tablets and, of course, brought down the second set of tablets. And as we are probably all familiar, the rabbis teach us that in the Beit HaMikdash, both sets of tablets, the broken sets of tablets and the whole sets of tablets were placed in the ark. Now, they say that this teaches us, and I'm sure we're all familiar, that an elder who has forgotten the Torah knowledge he once possessed is like those broken tablets. And they are to be, of course, honored. I think that's a fairly familiar teaching from the Talmud, but I came upon a different teaching, this time by Rabbi Mark Angel, and I thought I'd share it with you. It seems to be particularly pertinent to as we go into the holidays. Rabbi Angel understands the broken tablets that were not discarded as representing our failures. They represent the times that we've been shattered in our lives. They represent our shortcomings, our blemishes, our times when we did not succeed in rising to the occasion in showing our best selves. And there is a value in keeping the shattered tablets as well as the whole tablets. Theodore Levitt, a Harvard Business School professor, once said, "Experience comes from what we have done. Wisdom comes from what we have done badly." So we can deal with our failures and weaknesses in a number of ways. The first is to deny they exist, to sweep them under the rug, so to speak. This is the path to arrogance and overweening pride. Or we can ruminate on our failures and our weaknesses. And this is the path to depression, poor self-esteem, and paralysis. Or we can accept our failures and weaknesses as who we are, neither denying them or wallowing in them. By keeping the shattered tablets of our lives and the whole tablets in the same ark, so to speak, we can keep a balance in our lives. We're able to appreciate our successes and strengths, at the same time remember our weaknesses and failures. And this leads to a path of humility, understanding, compassion, and wisdom. Thank you. Let's do a little business. I want to thank people for paying their dues and remind others who have not done so to please do so. It's easy to do it online. I'd like to introduce, if there are some new rabbis here who have not been here who have joined us since the Kala, when we also introduced new rabbis. Would you please stand up and introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and where you are. Okay.
Hi, my name is David Chapman. I just started this summer at Congregation Beth Shalom in Northbrook. And I'm actually originally from this very synagogue.
Welcome home.
Everyone, I'm Philip Sherman. I am at BJBE in Deerfield, and just thrilled to be here with all of you.
Welcome.
Holy Guy. I was at Asher Shalom, and I recently started as the director of Hagar Chicago.
Welcome.
Okay, your being home reminds me, I was just at my home synagogue where I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I read a late little Torah there in August, and the cantor goes to me, "Welcome to our synagogue." I said, "What do you mean? It's my synagogue. You should be welcome to it because my synagogue, because I grew up there. He's a latecomer. He's only there 40 years or something like that. So nice to be home." Okay, now just wanted to say that give a heads up to members. We're working on a bylaws change that we need to be voted on by our entire membership. It's really revamping and relooking at the requirements for being a member of the Chicago Board of Rabbis. So we're updating that to be in line with other boards of rabbis and to be in the 21st century. So you'll be getting some more information about that shortly, just to remind you to be on the lookout for it, because there'll have to be a vote by the entire membership. Now, I would like to introduce Lonnie Nassiter. Lonnie is president and chief executive of the Jewish United Fund, the Jewish Federation of Chicago. There are three things that you might not know about him. I've done a little research. He's a White Sox fan. They have possible.
Tough to be a Lost fan.
Well,
Tough to be a fan right now.
well, I think you're overly negative about that, from what I read. He has a good jump shot, and he's a pretty good singer.
Wow.
And today is his birthday. So we're gonna sing happy birthday. Do you want to leave?
No, it's
No, you
okay.
can't leave for our birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Lonnie. Happy birthday to you. Lonnie is only the fifth person in JUF's 119-year history to become president and chief executive. He previously served on the Anti-Defamation League as an Anti-Defamation League's longtime regional director and of the Greater Chicago Upper Midwest region. JUF is the third largest foundation in Chicago, according to Crane's Chicago Business ranking of the top 25 charitable organizations. In a little more than 3 years, Lonnie has led JUF through COVID, a war in Gaza 2 years ago, the ongoing war in Ukraine. JUF has led the country's federations in fundraising for Ukraine. In addition to all of this and running the day-to-day operations of JUF, Lonnie is committed to maintaining a strong relationship, both personally and organizationally, with the Chicago Rabbi. Lonnie?
Thank you, Rabbi Rudolph. I appreciate that. And someone asked me, what do I want to do my birthday? And I said, I want to come here. Be with all of you, but in all seriousness, it's great to be here. Great to see all of you. I love coming here at least once a year to see all of your faces and to say my thank you for doing the role that you play in our community. It is not easy. I know that we have been through many challenges, as Mark just laid out. It's been a tough couple of years, and that you are really the backbone of our community. You're the spirit of our community. You are the rocks that people need to go to when they're dealing with all the myriad of issues that we're all facing right now. And I said this before this group, to use a sports analogy, but we ask all of you to be 5-tool players. Mark mentioned that I'm a big White Sox fan. Baseball has always been a big part of my life. And 5 tools meaning in baseball that you have a good arm and you're fast and you're able to jump and you're a good hitter and you're good defensively. We ask you to do a lot, and we ask our rabbis to do a lot. We ask you to be there for our community in times of great grief. We ask you to be there in times of simchas and great joy in our lives. We ask you to be intellectually stimulating. We ask us to make sure that you're actually providing the support and infrastructure of your institutions. I look at Nate right now sitting in here. And at the end of the day, we also ask you to be there for us when in fact we are at life's lowest points, and you're always there. And I just wanted to say thank you for your commitment. I also want to say thank you to my old friend, Elliot Cosgrove, for coming today. Many of you know Elliot kind of grew up here, grew up with Michael at Anshe Synagogue, got his doctorate at the University of Chicago, and for him to come back to just lead us in learning today just was a highlight for me as well. And I can't wait to hear him talk. And it was a treat during COVID, as we all did, to be able to kind of plug into different congregations to hear Elliot opine on the world. I think he gave me some great comfort to listen to some of his sermons during very, very low times during the COVID time. So I was asked to kind of give a couple of quick updates about JUF. And if we have a little bit of time, I'd look to Brady to kind of tell me how we're doing on time. We can also open it up for questions, but I also want to make sure that we're giving enough time to Rabbi Cosgrove. So the state of the Federation, I feel like I'm a politician. The state of the Federation is strong in the sense that we continue to really perform at a high level in terms of engagement opportunities, and also in terms of just the fundraising prowess that we have. Last year was the highest fundraising amount we've ever had in the history of the Chicago JUF at $90 million. So a credit to all of you for helping. I think we all are a part of the infrastructure that makes the annual campaign hum. Thank God for the annual campaign, because when we have situations, and I'll get to Ukraine in a second, but when we have situations like Ukraine and COVID, having that infrastructure as a result of the annual campaign allows us to pivot at a moment's notice to deal with the most stressful times in our community. So I want to thank you all for being a part of that annual campaign, for making sure that your congregants know exactly the importance of giving to the campaign and all the different places that JUF plays its role in our community. We are doing things in person again. We had our first King David Society. All of our women's events are in person. Our crown dinner's in person. Our annual meeting for the first time in 3 years will be in person in September. So getting people to come together and meet. We had JB Pritzker at our forum for our gubernatorial forum on Friday. We're back. There's some hesitancy, and of course, some people are comfortable, some people aren't. For those that are comfortable, they are coming together and we're in person. As a result, it does provide ruach, it provides connectiveness that we've really lacked the last 2.5 to 3 years. And that also is a momentum builder when it comes to just programs, when it comes to fundraising, and when it comes to overall community building. And in terms of JUF staff, I know that, a lot of people, a lot of businesses have really suffered. We haven't been immune to staff turnover, but it hasn't been a mass exodus. I know everyone talks about the mass resignation and all the rest, but we've been fortunate enough. I think it's a testament to the types of people that at JUF we hire, that this is their life's calling, that they're not looking to go do other things. They want to serve our community, and as a result, they are staying where they are because they believe in the mission, and we're doing all we can to make sure that we're increasing salaries commensurate with the level of their capacities, and making sure that in fact we're creating an environment where people feel good to walk into work. So that's a good news front. Community concerns. I was just talking to Rabbi Cosgrove and Rabbi Crane a little bit about mental health, and Rabbi Schwab about just where we're at right now. And I don't think any of us are immune from the anxieties that we've all experienced in the last 3 years, and especially its effect on our younger generation. I was just talking to Rabbi Schwab and Rabbi Tonkin about the fact that my little one, who's 13, came back from camp last week, and she had 8 weeks in her safe place, no phones, not the concerns that we live in the city of like, oh my God, I'm going to walk out and all the rest. And she walked to Whole Foods yesterday, and she said, Dad, I walked so fast and I was shaking because I was by myself and I was so concerned about something bad happening to me. That did not exist 3-4 years ago in terms of just her own processing of events and situations. And that's what's going through a lot of young people's minds: security, COVID, getting themselves back. And so as a result, mental health needs throughout our community have increased. I don't have to tell this group, I'm sure you're hearing it from your congregants. But as a result, we are responding in kind. We have allocated an additional $2 million for mental health, specifically find out where those dollars can go in our community. So we've already done a lot of surveys to all of you and many other members in our community. Where can we put these dollars, et cetera? So we're thinking of new innovative ways to deal with the mental health challenges that we're seeing. I also don't have to tell this group about security, but I'm, like all of you, are equally concerned about the state of the world, the ability for people to take out their hate, ideology, et cetera, in ways that are incredibly violent. I don't have to go through all the different incidents, including, of course, what happened just in Highland Park a few weeks ago. But it's something we all need to be mindful of. And as a result, we have really stepped up our game when it comes to security. We now actually have a name for our new campaign. It's called Root Secure Chicago. And the hope is that we will raise an additional $20 million that will go into a fund that will kick off dollars for us to really build a bigger security team at JUF, which will help all of you in terms of audits, in terms of helping with grant writing, situations where you may have big events, if you need help in terms of security. So we will be rolling this out. You'll be getting information from Rabbi Dickman about where we're going with all this. We're already reaching some success. We're about halfway there in terms of our fundraising goal, which is a testament to this amazing community. But once we get there, we will be able to really kind of grow this down in ways that I think will benefit all of your congregations and make sure that people, most importantly, feel comfortable coming to Jewish institutions. So it's not just having the security that hopefully is a deterrent effect from crazy people doing crazy things. But the last thing I want is for our families to have to think twice to take their children to an early childhood center, or for some Sunday school at synagogue, or to go to a CJE facility for their elder parents, et cetera. That's the last thing we want. So if JUF is all about taking care of the most vulnerable and engaging the Jewish community, I can't engage this community if people are feeling that they can't feel safe in a Jewish institution. So this is high on my list of priorities, and we'll continue to keep you posted. In terms of the world, I am concerned about the discourse that we're all experiencing in terms of left, right, conservative, liberal, et cetera, however you want to kind of phrase it. But I am beginning to see some fractures in our own community. in terms of the inability for somebody to say, well, I'm not going to be at that meeting because I don't agree with their statement on X. And I think we all know our history is that sometimes when we are our own worst enemy and we start fracturing, it really kind of leads to the downfall of our communities. You go back to history. And I'm not trying to be, too hyperbolic, but I am concerned when we can't have tough discussions. And I think it's a role that we all should play in terms of bringing people together and learn how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to really be active listeners, how to be able to respect the other side's opinion. I just think we are kind of taking on a reflection of our world right now, and especially our country when it comes to discourse and when it comes to the inability to really kind of think differently and to be a little bit more open-minded, just closed off in your own little sphere. So I think it's something we can think about. We're really investing in an organization called Resetting the Table. We've done about 5 cohorts. Maybe some of you are part of the rabbinical cohort. Thank you for being a part of it. But we're really trying to figure out ways that we can emulate how we talk to each other in a more civil way, because I do think it's something that we need to be mindful of. It's not where I think our community needs to go. We're better than that, and we need to really kind of like place some importance on that particular issue. Overseas, obviously the Ukrainian situation, I think in February, you all were glued to the TV, and unfortunately, it's a byproduct of where we're at in this world where we have short attention spans, but it's still a problem, as we all know, and we still have significant issues when it comes to the Jewish community in Ukraine in terms of what they're going to do. Those that have been in neighboring countries for the last couple of months, are they going to get back to some semblance of normalcy? Can they go back to their respective homes? Are they going to make Aliyah? 25,000 Russians and Ukrainian Jews have already made Aliyah. I was there in Israel a couple of weeks ago and got to meet a bunch of families. That's a big number for Israel to absorb. And that number I would anticipate getting only higher in the next couple of months as this saga continues. But Rabbi Rudolph mentioned Chicago's role. This community raised over $7.8 million for Ukrainian relief. About 6.3 or so went to the national campaign, which was headed by JFNA, and really went to our partners on the ground, in particular the Jewish Agency, JDC, who really are going back to infrastructure. Thank God those workers and our colleagues were on the ground, because that woman who lives in the 7th floor in Odessa, who's 89 years old and can't get out, still is getting her medicine every Monday morning. Those workers at JDC and Jaffe did not leave, even at the height of the craziness and the violence. They were continuing to provide services to our community. It's pretty amazing. And those that wanted to get out, we provided the transportation. In 5 neighboring countries, they were allowed to really kind of get a meal, be able to figure out where they could stay in a hotel. And then, of course, the Jewish Agency really stepped up their game in getting people out on planes to Israel. So an amazing, again, example, and talk about a juxtaposition of where we were 60 years ago, right? Now Jews are walking and non-Jews are walking away from violence, and the first thing they see is the Star of David, because our tents are open for business, so to speak. And so you see the fact that Jews are actually saving those fleeing persecution. It's a fascinating 60-year difference in terms of what's happening in Europe. And I think we're proud to play that role. But it is something that I think we can't take our eye off of. It's something that we need to think about. 200,000 or so Jews are still in Ukraine. 400,000 are in Russia. There's going to be a hearing in a couple of weeks about the Jewish Agency's presence in Russia, which could be really kind of a huge dramatic development if in fact Russians tell the Jaffe community to get out of Russia. I think that's going to be a game changer in terms of the Jewish communities really kind of like thinking of what their future is going to hold. So there's a lot at stake here. I want all of you to make sure that you're still connected to this. If you need to get updates, please reach out to me. Israel, I mentioned I was there. There's a lot of good. There's a crane on every corner, and I think that the new bird of Israel is the crane. Whether it be in Tel Aviv, whether it be in Jerusalem, Haifa, everywhere I went, there's just construction and growth, and the place is bustling with visitors. Tour guides are back. They don't even think about COVID anymore. Everyone's just walking around, and it feels good. It feels like it's bustling. Elliot, do you feel the same way when you were there? Yeah, it really did. It felt like pre-COVID. And there's much to be said about the Abraham Accords and what that's meaning in terms of what's happening. You saw the latest diplomatic breakthrough with Turkey. Lots of good stuff geopolitically. Iran is obviously still the main threat and the worry of everyone I talk to that's in high government in Israel. Looks like there may be some breakthroughs in terms of the Iranian deal here with the United States and Iran. In fact, this morning I got a briefing that said they're pretty close. I don't know what that's going to mean. I haven't, I don't know any of us know the exact details. It looks like the Iran Revolutionary Guard issue is now taken off the table, and they're willing to still claim that as a terrorist organization, which was Biden's big kind of sticking point. I hope and pray that the issue of the Iranian deal won't have the same disastrous effects it had in our community 6-7 years ago, when that issue, again, going back to discourse, just completely fractured us. I don't think it's going to be as hot, but on the other hand, it is a big important issue, and you could be certain that the Israelis probably, no matter what the deal is, will probably be not in favor of it because it doesn't go far enough, which I understand. The bad also, I would say, are the things that I'm concerned about is the political situation there. It was clear from everyone I talked to when I was there that the current government was a breath of fresh air in terms of getting things done, that they actually moved budgets, that things were happening, that I think it was a breakthrough in terms of having the first time and if ever a Muslim party in Knesset, which actually helped in terms of coexistence between Muslims and Jews. And the Muslim party actually brought back the appropriate resources to their communities. So the Arabs in Israel actually felt like they were a part of government in ways they've never felt before, which is good when it comes to coexistence, in my opinion. But of course, because the coalition was so tenuous, they lost it. And now they go back to elections in November for like the 5th time in, I think, 4 years. So unprecedented. I don't know what holds for it, but I can tell you that there's a lot of concern that, in fact, they may go back to a situation where there's a lot of dysfunction and it isn't as representative of the whole country in the next government. And the last thing I want to say in terms of just what's keeping me up a little bit at night is I do feel like we need to be mindful of the change in our community when it comes to mobility. And I'm sure many of you have seen this, is that COVID also provided for those people that had the ability to really kind of leave Chicago in ways that we haven't seen before. Even people of my generation are saying, you know what, I'm gone for 4 months. I'm getting a place in Palm Springs, or I'm getting a place in Florida, et cetera. And there's a concern of mine that we really need to focus on creating that stickiness back. And the more we become more mobile, the more we lose that touch that becomes Chicago. And I think there is something really unique about this community and the stickiness that we have, that no matter where you are, you always come back to your roots. Many of our young kids seem to come back after college. And I'm just worried that this migration is going to kind of have an impact on us. So I think it's important for all of us to maybe even get on planes and go see our community members in the Floridas and the Californias and the Aspens and all the rest, just to kind of create that stickiness. So I can tell you at JUF, we are going to be doing a lot of snowbird events during the winter, just to kind of make sure that we create that connection. Because I'd hate for us to be in a situation where we just kind of lost that mojo of feeling so good about Chicago and all the rest. So that's something that's on my mind, and maybe it's stabilized a little bit, but I'm just seeing more and more people just getting out. And that concerns me, because I think that's what makes Chicago so unique and strong. It's the fact that we come back and we're proud of where we are, who we are, where we came from. Even though Mark was talking about Pennsylvania roots, once you're here and you feel it, it's really powerful. So with that, I'm going to stop. If we have any time for questions, I'm happy to do that.
We have a couple of minutes.
Okay, a couple minutes. So the floor is yours. Thank you again for inviting me. Thanks for listening to me for the last 15 or so minutes, and thank you for all that you do.
Questions for Lonnie? Yes, you did.
I just would make one comment that as one of the rabbis that was privileged to be part of the resetting the table cohort, I found it to be a very valuable experience. And I appreciate the fact that the JUF is putting its efforts into it. And I want to encourage you to redouble your efforts in that
Okay,
area.
I appreciate you saying that, Rabbi Siegel, because these things aren't necessary. It's not about money, but it's about participation and are people getting the most out of it. And I value all of your time. But if there seems to be a kind of this groundswell of that would be something I'd be interested in, then we are going to kind of redouble our efforts, because I think it is something that's important. Thank you for that feedback. Okay. All right.
And I'd like to introduce Rabbi Michael Siegel, who will introduce our
I just want to take a moment and commend
Rabbi Reedy Dickman, Mark, and the other leaders of the CBR for all that they do for our rabbinic community here in Chicago. I think they deserve a round of applause. And of course, to Rabbi Crane for opening up your synagogue to us. Thank you. Not long ago, I was part of a conversation with other rabbis from around the country, and they represented the different streams of Jewish life. And one of the topics of our conversation was to imagine the role of a rabbi 5 to 10 years from now, and consider the training necessary for that rabbinic cohort. Amongst the responsibilities of this newly envisioned rabbi, there was a general agreement amongst younger colleagues that sermons were a thing of the past. Reasons given, people no longer have the attention span to listen to a well-reasoned sermon. TikTok brain is what I think they called it. Nor was there any real appreciation for the scholarship that went into a well-considered sermon, or patience for the intellectual rigor of sermons of the past. Now, all the rabbis that I was speaking with are thoughtful and successful. I take their views seriously, and I would admit that there is a certain amount of truth to their words. Times have changed, and the advent of watching services online creates its own set of challenges for rabbis. But to say that sermons are a thing of the past, I think not. For me, rabbis like Elliot Cosgrove are the corrective to that sweeping statement. Rabbi Cosgrove is a bright light in the American rabbinate. Truth be told, it was obvious when he came to Anshe Emet years ago that he was going to make a difference on the wider stage of Jewish life. It was my great privilege to work with Elliot in those early years of his rabbinate. And I'm proud to say that my work with Elliot inspired me to hone my own rabbinic skills in the process. The work that Elliot has done at Park Avenue Synagogue has been truly remarkable and inspiring. Under his leadership, this synagogue has transformed in every possible way, from its building to its programs, to its education, and of course, its services, which are watched across the country and even here in Chicago, I understand. Elliot has proven to be, and to me, a master of the sermon, even as he helps to allow it to evolve in these quickly changing times. Each time Rabbi Cosgrove speaks, his intellectual curiosity, his wonderful sense of humor, his love for all things Jewish, including rabbinic sources, his passion to connect with his listeners and take them on a journey of thought, journey of the intellect, to a point that when he finishes speaking, he has accomplished more than evoke an emotion. He's done more than just take a Jewish text and use it in support of a cause. Rather, Elliot has helped people to connect the Jewish dots and appreciate the wisdom and the relevance of our tradition. Elliot is a wonderful choice for our sermon seminar. This morning, I commend the leaders of the CBR for their wisdom. He grew up in Los Angeles, and Rabbi Cosgrove was privileged to attend Sinai Temple and be inspired by the sermons of Rabbi David Wolpe, another master of the sermon. He graduated with great pride from the University of Michigan, was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and as we learned, earned his PhD at the University of Chicago Divinity School. His dissertation on Rabbi Louis Jacobs, a leading Anglo-Jewish theologian of the 20th century, reflects Elliot's passion for the intersection of Jewish scholarship and faith. He has, as I think we're all aware, written extensively, and amongst his writings is a very important book entitled Jewish Theology in Our Time, A New Generation Explores the Foundations and Future of Jewish Belief, a book that he not only writes in but edited, a book that I would recommend for your own reading and for your congregation. Elliot is married to Debbie and has 4 extraordinary children. The author of Proverbs wrote, Tapuchei Zahav v'mashkiot kesef, davar davur al ofnav. Golden apples and silver carvings, a word spoken in its own right way. Robert Alter noted in his commentary, this image of exquisite jewelry for apt speech reflects the high value placed in Proverbs on eloquent and beautifully framed speech. Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove reminds us that the words of Proverbs remains true in our day, and that the sermon is not a thing of the past, but remains important for American Jewry as it continues to evolve in our time. Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove.
Wow. Michael, thank you. And whereas I could respond to your words with equally overflowing words, I'll simply say that whereas JTS was a place that may have given me ordination as a rabbi, it was you who made me a rabbi. And I will forever be grateful for the years working for you, working with you, and Anshe Emet. And I wish you and your beautiful family all good things in the future. Thank you, my friend. It's great to be here. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Rabbi Crane for hosting us. I want to thank Rini and Mark for the warm invitation and for making all this possible. Bonnie Eckstein and Lonnie on your team. It's really a terrific team that you've assembled, and I wish you and the Federation every success. It sounds like you have a full agenda. So stay strong. We're no longer the our kids who were this big when we were I was in Chicago are now in college. I wish you and your colleagues continued strength. And I want to say hi to Rabbi Kensky. And it's really, I feel like I'm in the midst of colleagues, I'm in the midst of friends, teachers, and as my dean at JTS. And I remember coming here when I was in Chicago with Michael, and I knew exactly we could get from the mikveh to what was that place that had the bison burgers?
Ken's Diner.
Ken's Diner. And I knew when to put the order in vis-a-vis the baked bean in order to pick it up and then drive back to Lakeview. So to say that being here in your shul, Rabbi Crane and Rabbi Kensky, brings back warm memories. They're both personal, culinary, and otherwise. So it's terrific to be back and to be with friends. I do also just want to note, and Lonnie, you alluded to this, and Mark, you did too, that one of the aspects, the price of admission, just seeing colleagues greet each other as you did, and seeing new faces and old friends see each other. I mean, wow, one of the signs of our time is that which should be totally normal has become remarkable. and to be in a room together with colleagues as we are right now is always, but especially given what we've all been through. As a congregational rabbi, I share these have been some of the most rigorous, actually I'll give them the most rigorous years of my career, at which we have love doing, we are not doing, that which we are doing, we are not trained to do. And I think this, and I feel like I'm in a room full of people who are on that journey together. And so if there was ever a time just to thank God to all be in a room with shared colleagues, this is it. Let's all say Shachianu Baruch
Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Shechianu v'kiyamanu v'kiyamanu.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
I want to dive right in because we have a hard stop at noon. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for about, why don't we say about 40 minutes right now, and go through an arc of my thinking when it comes to high holiday sermons. I want to reserve the last 10 minutes and open up this first session. I know not everyone can be here for the entire duration. I think that given some of the conversations, one of the generative parts of our time together is that we trade ideas. As the old adage says, Hagonav min haganav patur, the person who steals from the thief is not obliged. So the best ideas I've stolen from some people in this room, and I think that's the spirit that should inform our present efforts. When I sit down, and every source, everything that I'm referring to, some of it's in print in front of you, some of it is, all of it is on the web. And there are sermon books that are written, so it's all available. If you contact me afterwards, Rini, maybe you'll share my email with everyone afterwards. When I sit down, and Michael, you spoke about the craft of giving a sermon. If you look on, everyone have a handout, and we'll also send this out as an electronic copy. Hopefully those people online have that. I imagine a triangle in my mind. And I say the first corner of the triangle is a Torah reading or the context of the Jewish calendar. So it could be the Parsha, but it could also be you're speaking to people on Yom Kippur. We're not motivational, mere motivational speakers. For me, we draw people into our tradition. So it has to have a connection. It could be slim, it could be substantive to either the scriptural reading or the synagogue year. It's a rabbi's duty to make sure that every person, every Jew present emerges feeling part of the grand narrative of our people. The second corner shaping a sermon is, of course, what's on my mind or what's on your mind. We all come with that which we want to talk about. Sermons are forms of religious reflection and testimony, perhaps the most personal expression of my rabbinate and my vision of Jewish life. Writing a sermon is one of the few aspects of working in a synagogue that doesn't require a committee, a staff meeting, or budget process. Sermons are opportunities to give voice to my concerns, personal, communal, or global, and share my hopes and my love with the community. And the third, and this is where I think many of us slip, is what's on the mind of the listener. No matter what the Torah reading, no matter what I want to talk about, a sermon is a genre of expression that occurs in the context of a community. A sermon should be deeply relevant to the life of the listener. The best feeling one can elicit, and we've all probably felt this way at some point in our lives, that I felt the rabbi was speaking directly to me. And it could be Jewish, secular, or personal, a news event, a world event, something we're all thinking about. And I speak to congregants, I'm reading all the time, and any sermon may favor one corner of this triangle or another. And granted that I get to speak frequently, if I mess up on one week, I always have next week to get to. But a sermon that cannot be positioned somewhere within the above triangle is not, in my mind, a successful sermon. A great sermon is a sermon in which all three corners converge into a single point, anchored in Torah, deeply personal, and altogether relevant to the listener. And so that's how I look at the project of writing sermons. And when it comes to the high holidays, I actually do have sort of a template that I pour the cement into. When I think of Erev Rosh Hashanah, it tends to be some sort of warm up. I'm recognizing that a lot of people are walking into shul for the very first time. I'm not hitting them hard. I'm making them feel welcome, that they are here as a community. There should be a Hamishness in my mind. I'm going to stop saying that. If I'm speaking here, everything's in my mind. Take it or leave it, but you invited me. There's a Hamishness, a welcome home aspect, and a medley of the themes that we're going to hit on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Usually Rosh Hashanah is a day that I talk about the big global issue, whether that's a Jewish concern or global concern. That is, if some of us are in Kolbos, some of us have a rotation depending on the congregation. So second day Rosh Hashanah might be a particular issue, or maybe I'll teach a text on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, depending on the moment in my career and the community in which we serve. And Kol Nidre, I flip, so my sermon Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur Day is the same, and my colleagues flip the other way around, and that is when I go for the heart and I reach in and I try to rip out someone's heart and make them feel that they can be better people, that they really should apologize to their brother, that I go deeply personal. And then on Yisker, I will talk about memory. And oftentimes I learned from Michael, that's a time to craft a story that one heard, a meditative sort of opportunity to think in terms of the moment in the room. And then Ne'ilah is sort of when I'm done writing and I just pour my soul out in front of my congregation. And the gates are closing, and this is a moment to be raw and honest with my community. And actually, interestingly, I write almost everything out that I speak, even when I'm taught in the martyrology service or the Avoda service. I tend not to write out my Ne'ilah remarks because I just want it to come straight from the heart. And I know kind of directionally what I want to say, but then I just speak. So remember that as you are sitting down and thinking about what your messages are to your community this year, and your template might be different than mine. And then on page 2, this is a story. I had a very close relationship when I was in Hyde Park with the late great Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf. And he told me this story, which was actually confirmed in Kaplan and Dresner of Blessed Memories book on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And it's a great story that could actually begin any sermon that you're giving anytime in your career. That in June of '53, Heschel was invited to deliver the keynote addresses at 2 conventions. He was going from one plane to another, and 2 different speeches. The conservative movement asked him to speak about halakha, Jewish law, and the reform movement asked him to deliver a lecture on Jewish spirituality and prayer. So Heschel, because he was Heschel, decided to switch them at the last minute. Despite what he was asked to do, he gave the speeches in opposite context. He decided the conservative movement needed to talk not about affirming Jewish law, but what he called spiritual absenteeism. And then when he went to the reform movement, he spoke to them about the need to observe mitzvot. And several rabbis rose to their feet and berated him for his open digs in both conferences. He got on the plane, and it confirms that whatever is Heschel's erudition, he probably would not have made a good congregational rabbi. Okay? So it's a great story. It's in the Kaplan-Dresner book on Heschel, but it raises this question of what is a sermon that people want and what is a sermon people need? Okay, and so are you giving the comfortable sermon, or are you giving the, in Heschelian language, the prophetic sermon? And there are tough issues. Lonnie mentioned some of them in his opening remarks. If this year is the year of giving your Israel sermon,
on the side, or
are you giving a comfortable sermon, or are you bringing to the fore difficult conversations? And now all of us have, hopefully intentions to stay employed. So this is not without consequence here, but this question of what's a sermon that's easy and what's a sermon that's going to push our community into new territory, all within the bounds of reason. I think this is a question that we should all ask ourselves as we're sitting down, whether we're talking about Israel, whether we're talking about Highland Park, whether we're talking about any number of conversations that are like that game when we were kids. So what was it called? The surgery, where if you go too far this way, operation, and it buzzes one way or the other. These are, right, and we remember, the task of a rabbi, I don't know who said it first, is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So these are questions to ask as we're drafting out our remarks. How do I structure? Let's go to page 3. What I'm doing, I learned, did anyone here ever study with Rabbi J.J. Schachter? So Rabbi J.J. Schachter, I think, is probably, in terms of speaking, there's no one better. And if you ever hear that he's teaching or preaching, just go and ask questions later. He's who I learned how to write sermons from, and he had an image of the H. Now, this is the physical capital letter H. And so you can, there are 2 models of drafting sermons in my mind that I alternate with. I actually use the second one on the holidays. I use this one typically on Shabbat. So the first line of the H is whatever is on my mind or on people's mind. This idea of, making it an Easter egg at the end that only 7 minutes into the sermon, people actually know what it is I want to talk about. I don't do. Rabbi Schachter, sort of said, just drop it right there. And so if you see, I have hundreds of these, but right. So this is I guess my B'Halot class sermon one year. How should God's name be invoked on matters of public discourse and public policy? There's no ambiguity there. I know exactly what I'm talking about, and my congregation knows exactly what I'm talking about from the very first H. And then I go into the story of Eldad and Medad and the 2 very versions of Aaron and Miriam, and has God spoken only to Moses? Is everyone allowed to speak for God, or is only Moses allowed to speak to God? That's the second part, the line of the H. And then the structure of the sermon is the middle line of the H. I'm sorry, I don't have a blackboard that connects the second, the parsha back into that which I began my remarks with. Okay, so it's a rhetorical device that I credit Rabbi J.J. Schachter with. Now that's option 1, and it gets me from Shabbos to Shabbos. On the high holidays, you can call this by many things: slow burn, hook, stories, jokes, anniversaries. And so this was a Rosh Hashanah sermon from, it must have been in the year 2020, because it was an anniversary. No, I don't know when I gave this, but I talk about going to the University of Michigan. And when I was dropping my daughter off at the University of Michigan, I'm on page 4, and I took her to the pinball arcade. I took her to all the places I used to go, but I took her to the place where on October 14th, 1960, Kennedy announced the Peace Corps. And I paint the picture, and I did my research, and I found out all the context of what prompted Kennedy to establish a Peace Corps at that time in that election season, and which ultimately became his, what's it called, the inaugural speech, right? The Ask Not speech. And then after I've developed this idea of ask not and what's in it for me, but what's my role in it, then I go, today is Yom Kippur at the bottom of page 4. Today is a day set aside for an audit of the soul to acknowledge our wrongdoings and seek forgiveness. And then I italicize it for you, but at its core, Yom Kippur is a day to touch an ideal that in its fulfillment signals triumph of the human spirit, and in its breach, the sting of human failure. Simple in formulation, but difficult in implementation, Yom Kippur reminds us that we all exist in relation to each other, and therefore what we do matters. Our actions have the potential to transcend the limits of our own self-interest and to positively impact the world. Conversely, our inactions have the power to do harm to the world and the people in it. So there I developed this idea that what we do matters, that, you know, there's so many explanations of why we stand in community and confess our sins, but one of them is that it reminds us that what we do matters in the context of community. And so this idea, but you can see structurally, I began with a story. I began with this setting the theme. There was an anniversary being observed, and then I drew it in, and the rest of the sermon is all online. So same technique. By the way, you can use these, any story. You look at stories like Diamonds. Is that Taryn Tackman? Wow. Hey, Taryn. We went to Israel. Well, we did a lot of things together. You know, it's like a diamond that you turn it and the light, you know, shines through it different ways, you know, depending on how you want to use a story. So you'll see different stories, and depending on the point you want to make, it can be twisted, not twisted is the wrong word, turned towards whatever your nimshal might be. So too, I picked this one because I'm in Chicago, right? I told the whole Bartman story about Wrigley Field and how the Cubs, you know, what was that, 2003, Michael? So, you know, and everyone familiar with this story? I don't need to go through it all, but I used it, and there's a great, no, you're not familiar with it because you're from Haifa. Okay, so do your research on Chicago baseball history. This was the most inglorious moment of, well, actually there were a lot of them, but the curse of the Cubs, and we were living there in Lakeview during this time, and everyone blamed Steve Bartman for this incident that cost the Cubs the series, and the ire that was focused at Steve Bartman. And there's a great story afterwards about his sort of redemption. But the point that I was developing was that an entire city, an entire universe came down on this one person with this, if only he hadn't screwed it all up, then we would have been able to win the series then. And then you realize that there are actually a whole series of failures, and, you know, the human instinct that we need to hang the sin on one particular incident, one particular individual, but there's actually was sort of this massive breakdown in the Cubs, that they should have never been in that position anyway. And that was, and then I talk about Michael Lewis's book, The Undoing Project, which ties into Kahneman and Tversky's book, and their collaborative investigations into the manner in which people construct alternative realities in order to manage the difficult truths of their lives. And so how the stories we tell, more than the incidents themselves, are actually our self-identities. So those are sort of historical anniversaries, incidents, which I always try, right? There's nothing about the Bartman incident that I needed to say I was living in Chicago. There's nothing about the Kennedy incident but you can see that now some of us have put ourselves in sermons, some of us don't. I mean, that's a personal choice. My technique is that if I can create something that, like, I was living in Chicago at the time, right? I think it's a way to engender warmth in whatever the story is, historically or otherwise. So two stories that have worked for me on the high holidays. I told the Agnon story. I'm on page 6, which is about, it's called Pishnaim, Twice Over. And the protagonist sits at home before the holidays, unable to decide which of the two talitot to wear. Like some of us, he owns more than one. He received the first from his father-in-law, a scholar, and he wrapped books in it. He received it from the generation. The second talit, he had purchased one for himself. He had made Aliyah to Israel. He bought a new talit. And he wore that talit so he would fit into his new community. I'm skimming, but this whole story you can find on your own. And he's got to go to shul. He doesn't know which one to wear, the one representing his past, the one representing his future, the old world values, the new world. He agonizes, deliberates, sits in anguish, eventually closes his eye, takes whichever one is closer and gets to shul, and then he gets to shul and it's empty. Services are over. He missed the moment of prayer. The last line of the story, there I was like an apothecary, so long at work mixing powders for a drug that in the meantime the patient dies. I don't know if everyone's heard this a million times or if this is everyone, but let me just pause for a second. I know people on the screen can't necessarily hear the community, but how would you use this story if you're crafting a sermon? If this is your opening story, I mean, you could use it on Kol Nidre, you could use it on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Where? Let's just hear from a couple people here. Let's spark a little. Where would you take this? Yes, and say your name out loud because not everyone knows you. Yes. Give me. Okay. Good. So you could just to repeat for people on the screen, it's about relationships. It's about fixing relationships and not delaying on it. Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Name.
Hi, David Longfeld. It's a story about how a debate about what type of Jews you want to be can prevent us from actually being Jewish and doing the thing itself. So our community debate, tradition, innovation, looking forward, looking to the past, and we debate. We don't actually do it. Any option is better than nothing.
Right. So David Wolkenfeld says it's we can spend so much time debating on what kind of Jews we want to be that ultimately we're not. We miss the train on being Jewish, on doing Jewish, and very good. Thank you. And let's do one more. Yes, Doug.
Doug Zeldin. Just action and inaction. I said we spend a lot of time on silliness, on playing, on being indecisive on things, and we miss the opportunity a lot of times to focus on the tachlis, on the things that we need to really take care of the important things.
Absolutely. Indecision can be our worst enemy, and we got to focus on the tachlis. Thank you, Doug. I'm just going to move forward just for the purposes of time. So another story, this was one of my favorites. I think I used it for the first time at Anshe Emet, but that was like years ago and no one remembers. My dad, who was the son of a rabbi, said the greatest blessing a rabbi could have is to be blessed with a good memory and a congregation with a bad memory. And so, reduce, reuse, recycle. The problem is I print them all and now we put them all on the web and someone's like, whoa, Rabbi Cosgrove, you used that Primo Levi story 3 years ago. You know what? Maybe if you came to shul more. Okay. Primo Levi, the great author and Holocaust survivor. Anyone ever hear the story about the Metamir? It's a great story. It tells of a young man, Timoteo, whose father and all his ancestors as far back made mirrors. He took up the trade. I'm going to skim. And he spent his day making these different kinds of mirrors, some colored, some made people look short, some made people look tall. And then he made something called a metamir. A metamir is a metaphysical mirror that does not obey the law of optics, but shows your image as you are seen by the person who's standing before you. The idea was ancient, but Timoteo was the first to actually make one. So he took the metamir, flexible and adhesive, and tried it out. Yet he looked at himself and he saw nothing special, just a slightly balding 39-year-old with a dreamy yet neglected air. So he brought it to a woman who he had been unsuccessfully trying to court. She put the mirror on her forehead and he saw himself not just with a receding hairline, but completely bald, his lips hanging half open, his teeth rotted, and a positively moronic look on his face. He took it to his mother, and his mother saw Timoteo as an angelic 16-year-old blonde hair combed perfectly, just like in old school, right? In his old school photos. And so he takes it from person to person. And then the end of the story is the most important part. Timoteo took out a patent on his metamirs and began to try to sell them. However, every commercial attempt failed. Salesmen reported that customers were never satisfied with their image as reflected on the brow of their friends and relations. Nobody wanted to buy them. Nobody wanted to know how others perceived them. Timoteo tried to sell the patent, but nobody would buy them. The story ends. Timoteo resigned himself and continued to make flat mirrors which were indeed of excellent quality until the age of retirement. Where are you going to go with this? What's your next paragraph? Have a little bit of a workshop. Where do you want to go with this? No, well, Doug, let's share the wealth here. Anyone else? When on the Chagim could you use this story? It doesn't have to be a sermon, by the way. You could use it at Keenan. You could use it at any moment. And the Burns quotation is, "Oh, what power the giftie gives us to see ourselves as others see us."
There's a great Yom Kippur Kol Nidre story or sermon to give about how does God see us? After you go past all of all of the other, Yom Kippur is a night in it's a holiday, a day in which we reflect on how does God see us, and how do we live lives being worthy of being seen by God.
So Michael's taking it even beyond not just the interpersonal bein adam la'adam, but actually into sort of a shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid, the idea that on Yom Kippur of all days, we stand vulnerable and bare before the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Beautiful. I don't know your name, sir. Steve.
I would use it Rosh Hashanah Eve to set the theme for the whole holiday. I love to look in my mirror and see what I want to see, as opposed to what my mirror is showing me, and how challenging it is, to see yourself clearly in the mirror, let alone to see yourself through the eyes of how others see you. And those images are much more important than the fantasy that I create.
So focus not on the fantasy, but on our actual selves. Good. What was that famous story I once used that makes a similar point about the guy who, it's a classic, I don't know if it was Oscar Wilde, that he had a painting of himself, Dorian Gray. So it's the same sort of idea of the portraits that we paint of ourselves and whether we actually want to look at them. Let's take one more and your name, and then we'll keep going. Yes, please. Michelle.
It makes me think of the Zelda poem, Each One of Us Has a Name, and all the ways that others see us, and how that might be in conflict with how we see ourselves, and the sort of how we accumulate different identities or different personas or roles throughout our lives, and sort of being able to reflect on that.
So all of our different selves, Michelle, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Just something that also you can Google in the Park Avenue web page, which is, there was a great riff by Malcolm Gladwell that I stole, that he talked about, I didn't steal it, I gave him credit for it, that he talks about our different selves. And there's the self when, we're on a short fuse. There's ourselves when we're walking out of a bar at 2 in the morning. There are selves, they're all us, but we all have different selves. And he said, what is the point? He wasn't talking in a Jewish context, but what is the point of going to a house of worship? And he said, you enter into a house of worship for all sorts of reasons, for community, for accessing tradition, for, all the various reasons, celebrating things, mourning things. But at a certain level, we enter into houses of worship to access our best selves, to be more patient, to be more charitable, to be, all the things that we aspire towards, but often fail to achieve. And the most important word in all of this is ought, right? Who we ought to be. And the gap between, a good synagogue, a good mosque, a good church is a church which inspires people to close that gap between who they are and who they ought to be, and enter into the world at large in order to become the instrument to closing another gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. And then you come back to synagogue and it's a wash, rinse, and repeat. Okay. So Michelle, that I think adds to what you're saying. Then I just have a lot of jokes. I have this sort of Borscht Belt humor that's got me this far. Sadie and Abe had been married for many years. Over the decades, they built a life together, achieving great success. One day, Abe came home crushed, downcast and ashen. Sadie, I lost everything today, our savings, our yacht, our home in Italy, everything. Sadie, we don't have a penny to our name. Sadie, will you still love me? Without hesitation, Sadie turns to her Abe, says, Abe, I loved you the moment we met. I loved you when we had nothing. I loved you every day we've been together. I love you now. I'll always love you. I'll miss you. So it's an old joke. It's a great joke, but then I turn this in, and I'm not going to go into it, but just this question of relationships, about are relationships contingent? Are they not? You know, and then it turns into another way to open. Now, in anticipation of today, I'm on page 8. We have anniversaries, depending on your wiring. I love a good anniversary to frame a high holiday sermon. It's 100 years since Ulysses, 100 years since the Wasteland. I think I'm going to use the curious case of Benjamin Button. It's a short story. It's an easy story, but it's a story that raises all sorts of questions about mortality, and about the stages of our life. I'm going to get to this in the second session about how we live our lives and the chapters of our lives sequentially and otherwise. But I think simply who doesn't love Brad Pitt? And so they made a movie out of it, and then you can use this as a framing mechanism. 100 years ago, Fitzgerald, wrote this book. Enough people have read it, familiar with it, that then you can then use it as a way to contextualize something about the sequencing of life. So I think that's one that I might use. 60th anniversary of a variety of things. I was actually checking out Charles Schultz's "Happiness is a Warm Puppy." It's nice to quote Ulysses, but sometimes it's even nicer to quote Charles Schultz. And so if you can, and I think actually what's nicest is to be that rabbi who feels comfortable quoting both, and that's both part of your project. My name is Asher Lev. I mean, that's all about individual and community and how we see and think to sort of talk about that in the context of our individual and communal responsibilities could be a very powerful thread. In the Jewish world, there's obviously a million things. I just plucked these out. This is 125 years since the first Zionist Congress. That's actually being observed this weekend in Basel. And then in 2023, right at 75 years. And then ultimately and you'll see this in the second session, it's also 50 years since Munich. And so I think sort of the 125, 75, 50 way to frame an Israel sermon. If you're thinking of talking about ritual innovation or anything on feminism, 1922 is the anniversary of the first bat mitzvah of Judith Kaplan. So I think that could be a very interesting thing. And I gave a whole sermon on it, so you can steal that. The 50th anniversary of Watergate, 50th anniversary of the Munich massacre, 75th anniversary of Gentlemen's Agreement, which brought up issues of anti-Semitism. I live my life quoting The Godfather, and so if there's a way you can work that in, I applaud you. But there was a lot of press on that and its anniversary. And then these are punchlines to about a dozen jokes, which during the break I'm happy to tell you. I always keep it clean. I think that that's just, well, it's self-evident. You don't tell off-color jokes from the pulpit on Yom Kippur if you want to pay for your kids' college education. Okay.
Just one more to add. 50th anniversary of the film Fiddler on the Roof.
Oh, is it? Okay. We should Yeah, let me pause. Are there any other, and friends, let's all, so Michael just said 50th anniversary of Fiddler on the Roof.
Mark Spitz won 7 gold medals.
Wow. Mark Spitz, I'm going to repeat it so everyone hears it. Mark Spitz, 50 gold medals. In Munich. Yes, Michael?
Can I ask a question?
You can ask 10 questions, yes.
This is out of my own ignorance. With precisely these anniversaries, what would a 25-year-old be hearing? And some of these cultural things.
So I want you to hold on to that because but ultimately this is, you know, you're setting a context, you're creating you're level setting the room. And so, you know, you're functioning rabbi as teacher, right? So 125 years ago, you know, Herzl got up in Basel, right? That's not the point. You're not a history lecturer. You're not simply there to talk to them about Watergate or about, right? I remember a couple of years ago was the anniversary of the Have You No Decency moment, right? So I painted a picture of this moment. Who was the guy, the senator, someone? No, who stood up and said, have you no decency in the McCarthy hearings? Okay, so someone did, okay? And at that moment in time, then I talked about it was a sermon on civility. This is a rhetorical tool, Michael. But it also gives you a chance to teach and recognize that ultimately these are all to hook people in, because I don't know about the congregants of people in the room, but I have better traction talking about the McCarthy hearings than I do talking about a Talmudic text as my opener. Right, and then once I have people engaged in a discussion about what constitutes decency, well, then that's when I talk about these questions through a Jewish lens. Okay, was there another hand? Yes, and your name? Sarah. Sally Priesand in 1972. That was just a few months ago. That obviously in the spring, that the first Reform rabbi and rabbi period was female rabbi. Thank you very much, Sally Priesand. Excellent, thank you. I never put that together of 22 to 72, but it works sermonically. One more time. Okay. Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, 35 years since the first time the AIDS film was displayed. So if you want to talk about memory, how, I don't know.
Thank you. 35 years since the AIDS film for those online and memory. Okay. So one of, we're just going to keep going. There was a great article after Kennedy was assassinated by a journalist, Jimmy Breslin, and I've given you the link here to it. And when the entire nation was grieving and, you know, in this moment, he wrote a piece which some of you may be familiar with about the gravedigger. And so I call it making the small big. So he told the story and opened up the question of grief and otherwise, not by way of talking about the whodunit or the picture of Kennedy's kids or whatever it might be, but he took a moment that was out of the limelight, and then from that he took an expansive view and he made the small big. And so for me, this is, so if you're talking about the state of Zionism today, or if you're talking about Highland Park, or if you're talking about any number of things that you might want to talk about, you know, I find in terms of homiletic technique, not to focus on this year is the anniversary of, right? but actually to find some grain in there that then you're going to expand it well beyond. And so last year, it just so happened to be a Chicago-based sermon. One of these two stories I'm sure people are familiar with. One happened to a product of Park Avenue who was at Northwestern, and he got hit by a car when he was on an internship. And thank God he was okay. Sam, who I bar mitzvah, who grew up in my shul, and he was, the airbags blew out, the ambulances arrived. This happened in the south side of Chicago. Sam's car was totaled, second paragraph on page 10. Miraculously, he walked away from bruises from the seatbelt that saved his life. Nevertheless, they performed a CAT scan, and while there were no signs of concussion, no signs of internal bleeding, but there was something, and what they found, a brain tumor that had been there all along. It had been there growing over the years. He would have had crippling seizures, more perilous surgery, under medication. He had the surgery, he recovered, and he was in shul as I gave this. So I sort of staged this for dramatic effect. It's an interesting sidebar question to instrumentalize people's pain for homiletic purposes, but let's keep going forward. Physical health aside, how does Sam feel? Well, he started asking all the theological questions, right? And I was actually speaking to someone earlier who was saying, like, I went in for a scan for this, and they found that. And if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have known this. And you ask a million questions. And if he was on the passenger side, if it hit this side as opposed to that side, if he hadn't gotten the MRI, then all these what ifs. And so an interminable series of impenetrable what ifs, gratitude mixed with mystery, mixed with dread, prompted by the realization that our lives can be upended at any instant. Now, the second story I said is, and then I skip a little with the ellipse, but I say not all stories are like Sam's, who has this gratitude. The Chicago college intern Max Lewis, who was a rising junior, who was commuting home on Chicago's Green Line when a stray bullet ripped through the window and struck him in the neck. For Max and his family, there would be no redemption. He died 3 days later. Had Max returned one more email before leaving the office that day, had he taken a different seat on the train, had he bent down to tie his shoes or check his phone, or if the train was going faster or slower, he would still be with us. You can't have it one way or the other. For every Sam, there's a Max. For every person who was supposed to be in the North Tower, the South Tower, or the Surfside Tower, but wasn't, there was someone who might have been, but tragically was. Every CAT scan bearing good news, there's one bearing bad. No promises, a cauldron of chaos that can bubble over at any moment, the trajectory of our existence redrawn at any time. Then I say, today is Rosh Hashanah, Hayom Harat Olam, today of creation, but as John Levinson and others have pointed out, it's not simply a day to behold creation, but creation is established on a foundation of tohu vabohu, and a world both random and erratic, a world that can be upended at any place, in any instant. By this telling today, Rosh Hashanah is not so much a day to sit back and breathe in the wonders of providential design, but a day to sit up, take note, and ask ourselves how best to navigate a world shot through with contingency. Okay, so what do we do in a moment where the answer of who will live and who will die is not at all clear? Okay, but I'm using this because, well, it'd be tough to reuse it, but I just want you to see the technique of making the small big, using these two stories of Max and Sam in order to then get into a bigger theological discussion with my community of a world shot through with contingency. Yes.
Yes, second story, you're sitting your son. How do you lift them up a little bit?
Got to read the whole sermon. It was a tough sermon, but look, it was a very powerful moment when I had this young man just graduated right now from Northwestern. I mean, his story ended very happily. He's very, I mean, in a weird way, thank God, he had this MRI, which revealed this tumor that was in him. He's okay. The Lewis story is a horrifically tragic story.
But you end up by saying so it ends with a note of hope that there's an ability of speaking, there's a possibility of speaking.
Correct.
How do you give them that hope on Rosh Hashanah for the new year and not leave them with?
So hold on to that thought, because it's an idea that I'm playing with for this year, but for me, right, that's exactly the message of Unatana Toka, right? We don't know. The question is never answered. So given that uncertainty, how do we, face the year and face the day? Well, the answer is because it's all in our power, these instruments of tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah, human agency, to do that which we can. One of the books there's that I want to refer you to is about exactly the climate crisis, AI, pandemics, war. This is the question: what can we do? Are we frozen in fear of the unknown, or and message of the holidays is one agency? And so let's take a 1 and then 2 and then keep going. Yeah. Yes.
So, okay,
Anything.
great. So I totally agree and appreciate the idea that a powerful story, conveys so much and brings people to a sermon. And I'm thinking about the difference, like what is the difference between a sermon and a TED Talk? And do we need to adjust our writing styles because people are listening to so many podcasts, TED Talks, and that kind of thing? Like I'm looking at the sentence, and which is how I was trained to write sermons also, in the titular chapter of the book, it describes a series of towards the encounter of collaborative investigations of scenario in which people can discuss alternative realities in order to map the difficult truths of their lives. And I'm wondering, can people hear those sentences then? Does that make sense? And what does it mean?
Your name is?
Rena.
Rena, I think my most honest advice is you have to be authentic to yourself. I think stories and jokes and how we present ourselves in front of our communities are very personal reflections. And I think that our congregants can smell authenticity. And so I think that if that feels sort of cumbersome, might have worked for Elliot, but it's not going to work for Rena, then don't do it, right? And do what feels true to you, because I think you'll succeed best and your congregation will thrive most if people feel like, this is a story. I hear people tell jokes and tell stories, and I'm like, I could never get away with that. Like but that's okay. That's why there's 50 of us in this room, and and we serve different communities, right? What flies on the Upper East Side isn't going to fly in Brooklyn, and that's good. That's good. Was there one other hand? Yes. Your name, sir? And
law degrees and went out to celebrate at a wonderful occasion. They overdid it with the alcohol. And the way back, they hit a kid and he was killed. And he talks about how this completely turned their lives upside down. Obviously, the manslaughter charge and so forth. But he asked the question of how can one ever do teshuva for this particular act? And he basically comes to the conclusion that you never really can get can atone for a sin like that, but you you just keep on trying to build up a number of positive acts that might outweigh it all in the ultimate sense.
So Ed's sharing a story in the name of Rabbi Kushner, who talks about a terrible car accident that someone was a party to and how to build up. Ed, I want to refer you, and I'm thinking about this. One of this book, Daniel Pink, The Power of Regret. Has anyone seen this? So there's a beautiful image in this book. This is out, I think, this year. So it's a good book to have. About halfway in, he talks about the old school photo negatives, the black and the white on how pictures used to be done. And he talks about regret, not sort of, he sort of rejects this whole theory of no regret. He talks about that we need to lean into regret. And we lean into regret, and it becomes the darkness by which the light gets in. And so a life that is self-aware of regret is able to then look at the positive and leverage that. So, I mean, it's sort of what I call a one-trick pony book, but it's a heck of a pony. So Ed, thank you. Michael, we're going to lose you. I know you have to go. I'm sorry you're going to miss these. Okay. Okay. All right. I want to wrap up the first session, so let's get one more hand here.
Oh, I was just going to ask, so you brought in the power of regret, and I almost put it into something to order, and then I was like, wait, actually, for you? What's worth the full read versus the Cliff Notes version?
I don't know. So
It is worth the
I'll read an op-ed that someone does in the Times. I'll read a book review, and then I'll, and then look. The greatest gift getting a PhD at University of Chicago is how to pick up a book and not read it in full and find out what the main idea of the book is. There are very few books like that I actually read in full, but you just sort of figure it out to give a comp exam or to, give a sermon.
Can I just add to that?
Yes, sir.
Kindle is a great tool to skim through because you can look up, you can do searches, you can underline, you can pull things out. I find that using books that you're looking for ideas from, a Kindle can be a really good tool because and it's also cheaper and it doesn't take up shelf space, but you can kind of look through things and get a lot of good ideas out of it.
So Michael is saying that Kindle, that is exactly true, and I actually sometimes doubled it, but what I can't do on Kindle is this, and just kind of say, oh, that's actually, but you can, yes. Okay, so last things before the next things I want to say is, I'm spending a lot of time reading Herzl's diary entries for reasons of the 125th. And there's an obvious sermon to give about Herzl and 125th of Basel, but then there are less obvious things, and I'm reading it. And so I want to give you two that I found that I think are sermon worthy, and these are making the small big, right? And he's talking about August 30th, 1897. He talks about assuming the dais as he's elected president of the First Zionist Congress. Many people were profoundly moved. Only when I was calm. Only when I mounted the dais immediately after my acclamation as president and found among the mail the first letter from my Hans was I greatly stirred. At the presidential table, the present significance of which I am not overestimating, but which will grow in history, I wrote Congress postcards to my parents, my wife, and each of my children, Pauline. This is perhaps the first act of childness I've committed in 2 years since the movement began. So what an amazing story. Here's a guy, he's spent the last handful of years of his life, he's on the Zionist cause. This is a sort of peak moment that he's assembling everyone, and he's literally like where Rini is right now. He's just been elected the president of the Zionist movement. What's the very first thing he does? He writes postcards to his kids. I mean, so where are you going to go with that? So you could go with it sort of in a Shai Agnon, that story when he got the Nobel laureate and everyone was snapping photographs of him. People probably are familiar with this story. And then at that moment, he writes a note because they were like, just write something, make it look like you're writing. So we have a picture of you. And then one of the journalists sees what he actually wrote. And it was Ani Afar Va'efer, right? I am but dust and ashes, right? So even at our moments of greatest glory, there's sort of a humility to it. Even at our moment of greatest public acclaim, we remember that we're moms and we're dads and we have kids. Now, ultimately, another direction, a dark direction, is there's a terrible afterlife to all of Herzl's kids that a lot's been written about, and you can talk about his failures as a parent or Moses's failures as a parent, and all of that. But that's just, there's a lot of different angles that you can take this small and making it big. Right, and all of these are using rhetorical tools, and that might be something to the effect of what everyone might know is that 125 years ago, you know, Herzl was elected the leader of the first Zionist Congress. What you might not know is the very first thing he did, right? And then you have a party. Okay. The second diary entry that I just find to be exquisite is on his way out of Basel to Vienna. He writes, he's reflecting on the days that went by. He says, in deference to religious considerations, I went to the synagogue on Saturday before Congress. The head of the congregation called me to the Torah. I had the brother-in-law of my Paris friend Beer, Mr. Marcus and Haran, drilled the bracha, the benediction, into me. And then I climbed the steps of the altar. I was more excited than on all the days of Congress days. A few Hebrew words of the bracha caused me more anxiety than my welcoming and closing address and the whole direction of the proceedings. Wow, think about this. That this is Herzl, the founder of the Jewish state, put his heart and soul into this. What's actually his angst? Saying Baruch Hu et Hashem Barach, right? That he was so assimilated, secularized, whatever words you want to use, that the very, right? I mean, it's reminiscent of that story of, it's not a story, it's true. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs has special sessions for, when they place someone in Chicago or whatever. So when you walk into a shul, you know how to put on a yarmulke, and right? They train them about American Jewry or about Judaism at all, right? And so you could talk about that story as a story that signals something that you might want to pry open about religion and state in Israel, about Zionism and Judaism, and their connective tissue and where they disconnect. You could talk about sort of the founding vision of Israel vis-a-vis religion and state, and who Herzl was and where we are now. There are a million things that you can do with that story. Anyone else have a direction for that story? You just talk about Jewish literacy and mitzvot, and that we're secular and we might have college degrees and MBAs, but we don't know how to stand at the Torah and say a bracha. Not even Herzl did. Yeah.
Yeah, just if somebody stumbles over a bracha in the shul, they could be the next Herzl.
Beautiful. The next person who stumbles over a bracha in the shul could be the next Herzl. Thank you very much. I welcome. Yes.
And I don't remember anything else. Remembers the blessings. We still got those rated.
So how memory works, we might not remember anything, but we might remember a bracha. Thank you. One more or two more? Sid, yes.
I think that story speaks a lot to my congregants feel in many ways religious legitimate.
I love that.
Yet here's Herzl, who creates our Jewish state, to just give them that self-confidence perhaps, or open a door of legitimacy of who they are in this secular Americanism.
Sid, right?
Yep.
So people who feel a lack of legitimacy in their own Jewish practice.
Or self-doubt.
A self-doubt, beautiful. I mean, painful, but very honest. Thank you. Let's take one more, and then two more, really quick, and then yes. Yes.
Just build on what he said, like that even though he doesn't know the brachot, he's excited that the legitimacy or the illiteracy doesn't have to be a barrier to having a positive emotional experience. We can all get up and do something that we're maybe not going to be so great at, or that we might stumble over, and that doesn't have to necessarily be like a cause for shame or embarrassment. Like we could be excited to try something new that we might mess up, and find something beautiful in.
You should prepare for
It is prepared for it. Right. And Michael, I just want to come back to your point, like, who cares about the 125th anniversary, right? Okay, maybe I don't, or maybe I do, but maybe my listener doesn't. But what a great bridge within a sermon. If you're right, I'm planning on giving a sermon. I have a whole project, this thing about this fall about bringing Shabbos into homes, right? I feel that the ailment of our age is that whereas the Enlightenment said that you can be a Jew at home and a mensch in the street, the emancipation, our moment is a moment where people don't know how to be a Jew in the home, and that people, and Judaism is only something that happens when, the clergy are in the room. Okay, that's sort of my rant about the state of American Jewry and how I'm actually an enabler of that, but this isn't therapy. But that's this story, Michael, could start. It could be a bridge within. You might have heard of Theodore Herzl. What you didn't know is that he didn't know how to say a bracha. So, all right. The most least surprising thing about this moment is our totally mismanaged time. So let's do this. I want to go into a series of sermon threads. I had hoped, because Michael and I didn't want to talk about Highland Park without having, well, you're all Chicago rabbis. So let's take a bio stretch and let's start back up in about 8 minutes. Does that work? And then we'll go till 12. Okay, great. No, I have a telephone. Yeah. So we did that. We set it up during COVID, and it was also when we were late.
Hi. Oh, yeah.
It's really asking people.
Right.
Should we do it? Well, people are up and stretching and
Yeah.
bad for me. Can I do it right before Elliot speaks again? I literally will take 2 minutes and pass something around for people to sign their name. I'm asking people if they are willing to share their streaming links for High Holidays for isolated CJE clients.
I think that JUF, I know this, JUF contacted everyone and there is a list.
I didn't get that.
Okay, it exists. So you don't have to do that. JUF totally did that. There's a list. I'm putting it on the TBR website and I will send it to you.
Send it to me directly because I don't need the 2 minutes.
Okay.
If that is, but is it streaming and free? Like people could just access it, or do people have to because I'm talking about isolated seniors.
Yeah.
Who like the week of services are gonna go like to their therapist at CJE.
Right.
Ugh, I'm so lonely. That's what I'm talking about.
How do I pause this recording? Should I just not?
Pause.
Okay,
There's the
there you go.
pause.
Yeah.
So
Michelle Stern has a public service announcement.
Hi, for those who don't know me, I'm Rabbi Michelle Stern. I manage spiritual and religious life for our wonderful elder care agency in Chicago, CJE Senior Life. And inevitably, About a week before the Chagim, someone who is being served by counseling or care management will sort of be grieving and feel like they don't have a place to go for the holidays. They maybe are low income and they might be homebound. And so I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. If you are streaming your services and are willing to make them available for free to some of these clients, we will only give this information out if a client asks, but I'm trying to get ahead of it this year, these requests, because counselors inevitably get these requests and they don't know what to do, or they're kind of scrambling. So I'd rather give them the resources of who is okay with someone kind of not in the community, isolated, low income, older adult, being able to sign on for a service here or there if you are streaming your service. So, and this would be obviously, I know there's stuff on JUF's website, but for it to be free. And if you are not the right person to contact for finding out the streaming information that I can give to the counselors and care managers, please write that person's name or contact information on this sheet. So thank you so much. If you're not streaming or this isn't of interest to you, that's fine. Just pass it on and they'll eventually get back to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, it's 11:23 and we're gonna go till noon or a drop after that. And I apologize, I am going to run to the airport, but my email is not hard, Elliot Cosgrove @gmail.com. So if there are any, I may be in New York, but my phone is in Chicago. So I'm happy to follow up any of these threads. I want to do the first conversation with a great deal of humility, which is I recognize that I am a visitor here. I am not of Chicago. I'm going to try to manage our time. We're not going to cover it all, but well, this is one way that Chicago has been in the eyes of the Jewish world, which is a horrific shooting on July 4th. And I know I saw Michael, who's a Highland Park Rabbi, had to go, and who's the other, Wendy. So I recognize that there are people who in a profoundly personal way and your communities have been affected. I also recognize that there's someone, I met a colleague in Homewood who this is miles away, and there are people who have been managing the grief and trauma all summer. And there are people who will be walking into the synagogue for the very first time. And so to say it's complicated is an understatement. So I see my role for the next 8 minutes, 10 minutes as moderating a conversation of respected colleagues, and not so much. I've given you a couple sources here in the face of tragedy. One of my go-to sources is talking about grief. And where God is at a moment when from Colonimus Kalman Shapira, the Esh Kodesh. So you have that God is right there weeping with us. And then there's also the famous story of Elijah winding and unwinding the bandages, that in the face of pain, we respond with human action. But that's about as much as I want to share. To recognize the diversity of views or how this affected us. Is anyone, brave soul, want to sort of talk about whether you're talking about Highland Park, these high holidays? Or if you are, at what point you might do that? Or even if you say, look, I'm in some western suburb of Chicago, I may as well be in another state. It happened over there. I don't know. I simply don't know. So I'm going to ask people to be vulnerable and share where your thinking might be. Sure.
I'll just share like as someone who is, you know, is somewhat proximate to
Okay.
the situation. I mean, I wasn't.
Wendy?
Wendy.
Okay.
That, you know, I mean, I don't know if any of us will speak on this or not, or how, I mean, we will name it obviously in some way, but what I will say is that I think there is the larger opportunity to ask the question, why not me?
Mhm.
Which is true of any horrible thing. It goes to your point before, you know, about who will live and who will die. If, you know, shootings happen everywhere. And they happen all the time in great places and horrible places. There's no reason that this wouldn't have happened here. And I think that there is, at least the victims that I've spoken with, like that's a truth that they have shared with me that I have taken as counsel. So I offer that only as a place of consideration.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and your name is?
Philip Sherman.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that for people who are online, but Wendy shared, I don't want to Rabbi explain what you just said, but thank you. Okay.
Also, the Austin in the town, your children, for that part. New to the community, July 1st is a whole other layer that I'm grappling with. But that this feels very much in a more integrated of everybody in our community. Going throughout the holidays, to elevate teens who may have been at the parade or to just have different moments that we talk about just the experience of living in this moment. I think is a little bit more of how our clergy team is thinking about it.
Thank you. Elevating the experience of people who may have been in the moment, whether it's teen, I'm just repeating for the purpose of people online. So
Both about the tragedy and the shooting, but also just what it means to live right now.
let's take one. Yes.
Thinking about it too, and it's a contrast or tension with, I think what Lonnie was saying at the beginning. There's, on one hand, we're back, we're doing things in person, we're gathering again. Thank God it was the first parade after several years of not having the parade because of COVID. And then like the flip side of that, and there's no moral message to it. It's just a heightened tension. The flip side of, okay, we're gathering in person, and then we're exposed in a different way, again, in a way that maybe we've forgotten about because we've been in our homes for 2.5 years, to the chaos and the contingencies, to use your word, of being in a world where things happen.
Where there are all no promises. So that sort of decision of, right, are we back to normal? Are we not back to normal? Yeah, Mark.
Just the blink of an eye. It just, remind me of your sermon, in a blink of an eye. So you can use it kind of a local thing. Also, how the community now looks different. The mirror type of thing. Holding a mirror to a community which seemed one way. Now it's changed. So
Right, the shattering of that sense of safety and security.
who we are.
Which, you could sort of integrate some of these things, which is, sort of right? This is also something that, Pittsburgh felt, that, Southern California felt, that other, but, you have to, one and then two, and then, yeah.
The 70% of my congregation are my Shabbat congregation on the holidays. I may mention it or not mention it, but I already did on my TV show. I did 2 episodes with victims and people who were there, and the memorial service for them. So I feel like bringing it into the high holiday sermons is almost bringing pain where it doesn't need to be, because it's been so within and saturated within them. And then the social media community that I also serve as a rabbi. So I think I'm not going to speak about it because of that, but just maybe make mention to it along with other things.
Right. So this is something that I learned from Michael, that, there are weeks where you have written a beautiful drasha on something, and then all of a sudden a bomb goes off in Israel, and you say, wait, what am I actually going to do? And so you sort of have to name it when you do the prayer for the state of Israel, and then you give your, sermon on whatever it is you were talking about. So I think that's a calculation, Doug, that you're giving voice to of, okay, well, if this is a year I want to unroll my social justice program or bring Shabbat in the home, but I know I need to talk about this at somehow, because otherwise, I'm being derelict in my, which you may not feel I'm putting words into your mouth. Then you might say, all right, maybe we'll figure out a way to talk about it at Martyrology. Maybe we'll figure out a way to talk about it at Yisker. Maybe, right, there's a moment to name it, because you feel you'd be in breach otherwise.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say that we are gonna be talking about it at Yisker. We're a Reformed congregation, so we do a lighted candle ceremony. And one of the candles is going to be for gun violence. That's then also not just about Highland Park, but also gun violence in our city and people for guns in the city, as well as nationally.
So Shauna, I'm just repeating that it's going to figure out a ritual for it, but also bring the focus not just to gun violence in the city, but also gun violence nationally.
But actually
Right.
how it's, and not just about mass shootings, but also about gun.
Good. Thank you very much. Any other comments on this? Okay. Yes.
You and I had a brief conversation about this a few days ago. Going back to your comment about gauging what people can hear, I think that's good. That's a very difficult and challenging issue for us. Like, where are people in the room when we are so inundated all the time by this latest news story or this moment that feels like the world is about to collapse on us? This feeling of exhaustion when you get in. What are people looking for when they are sitting in their seats? How do we gauge that? That is, and especially when it hits so close to home, as Wendy was saying earlier, it's really a very challenging balance, I find. And it goes back to, what do I want to say? Like, where am I coming from? But what can people hear?
You're speaking, just to repeat myself, because it's never stopped me before, you're speaking to multiple audiences. You're speaking to people who've been knee deep in this conversation, and you're speaking to people, and your shul has had 1 million responses over the last few months, and you're speaking to people for whom this is the very first time they're walking into Jewish space. It's July 4th, and they're actually expecting, what does a rabbi have to say about the major Chicago, trauma of the summer? Okay. Look, my encouragement to everyone is to lean on each other. Those tend to be more than opening up a book, is picking up a phone and speaking to a colleague. I teach at JTS, the rabbinical students. This has nothing to do with anything. But in the final paper that I assign them, I grade them not just on their paper, but I have one other student in the class read their paper and affix their signature for typos, editorial, but also substance, because I want these rabbinical students to realize that their success is going to be, I keep using the word contingent, on their ability to get the support and rely on each other. And so, they probably hate me for it or think I'm weird, but it's phone calls I have during these weeks that help me formulate ideas. Okay. So there is, I'm going to arrive at this book. Someone asked me how often I read an actual book. This, you can do it on the cheap. There's an op-ed by William McCaskill in the last few weeks, or there's a podcast on Ezra Klein, What We Owe the Future. But he introduces this idea of plasticity and rigidity, periods of plasticity where I'm moving on. Ideas or institutions can take many forms, followed by a period of rigidity or ossification. Think of glass blowing. The glass is molten and malleable. It can be blown into one of many shapes. After it cools, it becomes rigid, and further change is impossible without remelting. So I think this is a moment we're in. It's not a congregational meeting. I think there has to be a homiletic way to talk about the tectonic shifts that are taking place in communal formation right now. Lonnie mentioned some of it about how people are snowbirding and people are taking time in and out, but I think that the ground is shifting from beneath us, and I think as professionals charged with, communal-based institutions, it's playing out in our day-to-day lives, in how connections are made, how membership is happening, how our community is practicing their Yiddishkeit. It's happening not just in Jewish space, it's happening everywhere. My dry cleaners told me that they're closing on Friday because people are not going back to, getting their shirts pressed the way they used to. And so I was like, well, what am I going to do? And he said, no, I'm renting a space in Queens, and you just call me, or I have a website now, and you can now just let me know. I'll pick up your shirts and I'll deliver them to your home, but I'm not going to have a storefront anymore. Okay, that's one of like a bajillion stories right now of how how institutions that are sort of storefront based are reimagining their futures, given the plasticity, right? We're not COVID and we're not back in person, right? As evidenced by the screen in front of me and the human beings in front of me as well. But we're in some new, undefined, brave new world that is going to have profound implications on this thing called synagogue, and how we're going to do it. It's part of my bigger question of bringing Judaism into people's hands and practice. So, the one image I use, if you're familiar with the philosophical thing of the ship of Theseus, where there's a ship and the philosophical question is asked, right? If I replace one board at a time over the course of time, at what point is it the original ship and at what point is it a new ship? So I was thought of this when I saw the Beach Boys over the summer play, and they, none of the original band members are still living, or two, all right, fine, but whatever. But I was like, am I watching the Beach Boys or am I watching something else right now? And so at what point, is a synagogue a synagogue? And at what point, have we, redeployed our offerings to, so I think these are all interesting ideas that if this is where your community is, and the obviously I've given a sermon leaning heavily on Kaplan, and Abraham is smashing a smasher of idols. I mean, this is sort of from, it's actually from this week's Parsha on, right? Think about what happens in this week's Parsha of going from, a diffuse observance to in the place that God will show you in Yerushalayim, ever since that moment of centralization of cult, all the way through Kaplan and beyond, Jews have always redefined how they've practiced their faith. And I've given a few sermons on that, one leaning heavily on a guy named Clayton Christensen, who passed away a couple of years ago, about disruptive innovation. There's a great quotation from Soloveitchik, that it's not just God as creator that we celebrate, but it's us as creators of the universe. So a hopeful message there. There's a cute story about BC and AD, that whether Jews can use these words, and I'm not going to tell the whole story, but he basically says AD means after that, and BC is the idea of before COVID, and AD is after that. We're still in the midst of the pandemic. We've yet to return to normal, but I want to talk about BC and AD after that. Another story that I think could frame things, university alumna who was invited back to campus years after graduation, given the chance to meet the university president, as she was introduced to the now elderly president, she took him aside and said, "Sir, I will forever be grateful to you for the words you said to me on my graduation day as you handed me my diploma. Over the course of my life, there have been ups and downs. Thank God things have turned well. But in the dark moments, it was a wisdom you shared with me that graduation day as you gave me my diploma that sustained me throughout." The university president was at a loss. He turned to the woman saying, "I'm humbled by your kindness, but I've presided over decades of graduations, handing out more diplomas to more people than I can count. I don't remember. What did I say to you?" The woman looked at him and said, "You said, keep moving." So a sweet story, but somehow we have to keep moving. And then a famous, perhaps overused, perhaps it's the first time you've heard it, when Kaplan was teaching homiletics at JTS, the late Arthur Hertzberg, you recalled how on Monday Kaplan would model a sermon on the weekly Torah readings, and on Wednesday a student would do the same. Kaplan was a mean teacher. He instilled so much fear that when Hertzberg's turn came, he delivered word for word Kaplan's remarks. Hertzberg finished. Kaplan proceeded to tear Hertzberg's sermon apart. But Dr. Kaplan, Hertzberg replied, "I'm only saying what you said the other day." But Arthur came to reply, "I've evolved since then." So the idea that we evolve and that we change and that we have to imagine tomorrow as a day different from today. And it goes back to the riff from, this is a prophetic vision of whether it's Moshe with the slaves or otherwise, of imagining an as yet unrealized future, which if you want to take your community there, then, figure out a framework by which you can do it. I'm like really worried on page 16 right now of this whole story of what's happening in Russia with Russian Jewry. I don't know if people are following it, but the shuttering of the Jewish agency is imminent. There are tens of thousands of Jews who, this is like a reversion to the Iron Curtain days, and the Jewish community there is a pawn in a much bigger game. And I had this experience of going to Poland with the Federation. And it was a very powerful experience. And then this summer when I was in Israel, I visited I'm even doing your work for you, a Federation-funded Jewish agency camp. It was actually a very moving experience. I was there and they were doing an icebreaker of kids who had been refugees from Ukraine, and they came over, and obviously their families are all dislocated. And one of the ice-breaking games when I spent a day at this camp, Kiryat Yearim, was that they said, if you could have dinner with any person, and one of the kids said, I'd have dinner with my dad. And it's like a game we've all played at camp, like which celebrity would you want to have dinner with if you could choose whatever it is, Taylor Swift or someone. So this I think this story of Ukraine, of the Russian Jewish community, the two Rosh Hashanah Russia-related stories that I've told in the past. I don't know what to do with either of them, but I'm just trying to give you something here. Is Babi Yar, which happened on Rosh Hashanah, September 29th and 30th of 1941. And then slightly more upbeat is the famous story of Golda Meir, who went to the Russian synagogue, the Moscow synagogue, and just as and everyone started chanting and broke out in song with Hatikva, and she turned to the crowd and said in Yiddish, "Thank you for having remained Jews." And so I think that is sort of an element of global Jewish concern right now, that if the next 30 days go where I think they might go, I think the Jewish agency is shut down. There's going to be tens of thousands of Jews who can't get out. And that's a disaster. Let me just press pause there. Is there anyone in the room who's thinking of possibly taking on Ukraine, Jewry, Russia, any of that on the holidays? An angle perhaps that okay. I don't know when. Look, it's yeah. I don't know. I had a moment when I was benching the other night and that, we've gone through, the harachamans of Birkat Hamazon, and, sometimes we say, oh, well, we no longer have to say the Anetunim Betzara, because Syrian Jewry's fine, Ethiopian Jewry's fine, like Russian Jew. Well, actually now world Jewry's not fine. Okay. Next, number 4. We talked about this, Zionism at 125, Israel at 75, Munich at 50. So the famous Herzl diary entry, were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I will guard against pronouncing publicly, at Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud, I would be answered by universal laughter. If not in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it. So I don't yet have the heart of this sermon, right? I don't know what the strings are, but I actually think this is a sermon structure that can work whatever your politic on Israel might be, which in this moment of time when we're all talking about originalism and what the founding fathers actually intended, it's vocabulary that's been used all summer. I think actually sort of picking up the Jewish state. It's a thin book, so those of you who are worried about, your reading list, and you don't actually have to read all of it, you just read the relevant pages, not about whatever. But you can see when, and he wrote it the year before the Zionist Congress, what did Herzl actually think that the Jewish state would turn into, right? Where was he on issues of religious pluralism? The actual thrust of the book is that this is the answer to address anti-Semitism, and but has the state of Israel now, 125 years later, normalized the condition of the Jew? What a great question, right? If that was the intention of Herzl's book, right? Where are we on that question, right? And given sort of the divisive state of sort of the Israel conversation, and do we feel more secure, right, as Jews in the diaspora because of the state of Israel, right? I grew up on that. Everyone said, well, now I can hang tall, whatever, right? Tell that to people who in Squirrel Hill, right? That doesn't help. The state of Israel doesn't help. The Arab question, the hidden question, how did Herzl address the hidden question of what's going to happen with the folk who are living there already? And where are we on that now? Did Herzl address the question of a Jewish and democratic state? He did. And the question of whether the new state should be what's the line between a Jewish state and a theocracy? He does. But where are we on it now? And what are our concerns as there's an election coming up in just a couple months? Religious pluralism. Did he imagine that we'd be in the state that we are in now? The hegemony of the Haredi community on all matters of personal status in Israel. So kind of the WWHS sermon. What would Herzl say? And I actually think the beauty of this structure is you can say anything you want, right? If you want to, whatever your politic is, right? If you want to, make a very critical sermon, say, Israel has, not by my standards, but by the standards of Herzl stated out. Michael, I don't mean to pick on you, but I think this is like a structure that gives people the bandwidth, because it's a rhetorical tool. You're creating a bar that's not, Reni's bar of whatever her rant is on the right or the left. That's actually what the man actually said, Herzl. And where are we today? Now, what I don't have is heart, because I don't think it's enough to simply just give sort of a historical before and after. But thank God that I have 5 weeks. Anyone have any sort of immediate, anyone thinking of giving? I don't know what people's politics are. I don't care, actually. Are people feeling an Israel sermon in the air, or are people feeling like this isn't the year to give an Israel sermon?
Well, I'm giving an Israel sermon, but it's creating space for people to talk about Israel. So
giving people, so I'm just repeating, giving people space to talk about differences. Israel across differences.
We don't really take that all the time, and it is, and in our synagogue, we want to actually do that.
Okay, so we want to be a synagogue that creates space for people to talk about, right? It's whatever this program is, Lonnie, about resetting the table, right? Good. Okay. Anyone else? Anyone feeling an Israel sermon coming? Okay, well, that's actually a great line for a sermon. I was at the sermon writing seminar for the Chicago Board of Rabbis, and this guy said, how many people are thinking of talking about Israel? And there was, you could hear a pin drop. What does that say? Right? I don't care where you take this. I'm just talking about homiletics here. What does that say about the state of the diaspora-Israel relationship? That, with one exception, you know, there was not like a Israel sermon. It's worth like 2 lines. Yeah.
Thinking about, or actually I've structured a sermon to talk about American Jewry after a hiatus that takes us to the Second World War, Shoah, State of Israel, has been really the focus of American Jewry. But now that Israel is secure in 2022 in ways that I don't think we could have dreamed about in 73 or 67, perhaps it's time for us to rethink what the trajectory of American Jewry is, not in the shadow of Israel, but in partnership with Israel, and how do we go forward? I don't think that's a question we've actually been focused on as a question outside of the sense of emergency that we normally feel with Israel. And so how would we approach that question today?
Okay, we're going to move forward for reasons of time. One thing that we're actually working on is if the Federation, Jewish Agency, JAC, and I feel morally complicated about this because there's a problematic in this, but of bringing, you know, shaping the Israel narrative, not just in conflict. And if there is someone who can speak to the congregation who is going to go to different, you know, over the course of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we'll give different people and we'll house them and pay for their arrangements and otherwise, that a Ukrainian family who's been taken in by the state of Israel can sort of give a positive narrative of like, look, at the end of the day, if not for Israel, all these, you know, refugees would, you know, not, you know, so that's something I'm working on. I don't know if it'll come to fruition. So this McCaskill book, I think this is actually one of, and there's 2 books. There's this McCaskill book, and this guy actually, I think, wanted to be a rabbi. He says in his introduction, Ari Wallach. Some people know him through the Jewish community. He's got a TED Talk out there. And so the book is about, the McCaskill book is about long-termism. This came up earlier. Positively influencing the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. Long-termism is about taking seriously just how big the future could be and how high the stakes are in shaping it. If humanity survives to even a fraction of its potential lifespan, then strange as it may seem, we are the ancients to live at the very beginning of history in the most distant past. What we do now will affect untold numbers of future people. We need to act wisely. So whether it is AI, whether it's global pandemics, whether it's the environment, whether it's war, right? This Unatane Tokef message that we were talking about earlier about given it's not who will live, it's not who by fire, who by sword, but we have our own modern list of plagues that afflict us. And so what can we do now? And there are beautiful passages in this book about transgenerational empathy, the lifespan bias, right? We make decisions based on the here and now in our own lifetime, but to what, obviously we're informed by the past, but to what degree do we allow ourselves to be shaped by our obligations to future generations, right? And this is in the text itself about the sins of the present are visited upon the Shilashim, the Al Ribeim, the idea that what we do now actually has implications for the future. It's, you know, this is the beginning of the Shemitah cycle. So you could talk about, you know, that Jews have always worked on a longer term time, what our obligations are to future generations. You know, think you could draw on a personal story. You know, many of us have relatives who came over with an imagined, even though the fruits of our journey won't be experienced by my generation, in future generations, right? That's very much the story of American Jewry, of the sacrifices other people made in order to play the long game intergenerationally. You know, you can talk about Abraham going to Canaan, Joseph going to for his brothers going to Egypt, the children of Israel to the promised land. I'm on page 18, Hatikva. This is also about sins, the things we screw up, we're screwing up for future generations. You could talk about the, you know, the Supreme Court, and, you know, depending on what side of the political divide you're on, but it's very clear that one side was playing the long game to create a certain vision of America. So who's winning the long game right now when it comes to our global priorities? You could talk from a Jewish the idea of Shabbat and mitzvot being opportunities to think about the intergenerational transmission of Jewish journeys. You can put it into people's laps and kind of ask people, you know, stop thinking about, you know, the next TikTok video, but think about where you're going to be 7 years from now, and start acting like that matters. If you go with the Shemitah idea, I saw this great quotation from the late Rabbi Sachs. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that if we work hard enough together, we can make things better. And that's Sachs. And then there's a book from a Buddhist eco-theologian, Joanna Macy, which has some nice quotations in it about this idea of active hope. It's not just a matter of wishing, but it's a matter of making something a reality, which of course brings us back to, if you just want to talk about, you know, if you will it, it's no dream, you could go back to Herzl as someone who imagined something 50 years henceforth. You know, I'm both sad and happy that we're running out of time for the last one, because I think this is the one that's going to break me. I think this is one that I have no idea if I'm going to have the courage to give. Guess what my age is, but I'm of that generation where my kids are launching or launch from home, and my parents are asking some tough questions about mortality, about end of care. Michelle, like, I'm sure this is, you know, right? Did I get that right? Yeah. You're you know, our elder care professional here. So I think this question of, right, we have so many texts and sermons that we've given about, you know, spouses, about children, about siblings, about all sorts of relationships, grandchildren, and the holidays are filled with sort of parenting images, Ben Yakir Li, Karachem Abba Banim, Avinu Malkeinu, right? It's all over the place, but what about parenting our parents? And what's at stake in that moment, right? There's obviously the question of, you know, safety and dignity of our parents, of fulfilling Kibud Av, that now it's not about them caring for us, but it's payback, and the complexity of the role reversal, the pathology of parents who won't take and children who won't give. It's a question about just mortality, you know, to put someone in assisted living is also seen as sort of, you know, are you just trying to do away with me? And the question of transmission of values, of course, depending on the family structure, this can get very complicated among siblings. who's paying for things, who's managing things, right? It's a very raw sermon to give. My parents are Copus Mentis, so this is why I don't think that might give this sermon, because, right, the rule number 1 of sermon giving is, sur meraba sento, right? Do no harm. The last thing I want to do is be that jerk who gives a sermon about their parents while their parents are still in this world. And so I don't actually have, I was trying to think about what the texts are that I would do. The high holidays give us the Vayelchu Shnehem Yachdav about Isaac. Maybe there's some way I can turn that diamond of Isaac taking responsibility post Akedah. I don't know if that could work. You can, I suppose it's not high holidays, but talk about the Moshe Yitro theme. I heard by way of a friend, there was a famous, it's actually not, that's a lie, it's not famous. It's a book called Botany in the Bible, which is anything but famous. It was actually talking about this, the verse from Psalm, Banecha Kishkilei Zeitim, and he describes how olive trees are actually grow, and what happens is that there's one tree, and then the seedlings go around it, and then grow up, and the first tree goes lower, and the shade from the other trees cover that. This is actually apparently how it works. And so this image of, right, this that your children should be, sitting around your table from Tehillim could be a powerful image. And then ultimately, as I was saying to Doug earlier, right, this idea of agency is the next generation picking up the responsibilities of the past generation. Are you hosting Shabbat dinner in your own home, right? Whatever that laundry list of things might be, right? That the past generation did is big. But I'm struggling with it, as you can kind of tell. I don't know how raw to go. I don't know if anyone's ever given any sermons on parenting parents and intergenerational transmission. Michelle, you're the authority in the room.
A lot of teaching on this because I'm dealing a lot with the parents who are now being parented, and so that's just pastoral care. But text that you don't have here, which might be worth considering either for a study or for a group or even for a sermon, are the texts about the rabbis dealing with aging parents. So there's the story of the rabbi, I think it's Rabbi Charbon, who his mother walks on his hands through the garden, and the rabbi praised him for ultimate honoring his parents. You can also flip that on the other side to say that might be abuse. There's a dynamic there that might be abusive. And then the other text is about the rabbi who's taking care of his mother, and I want jewelry, I'll give you jewelry, I'll give you everything you want. And then when she says, I want a husband as handsome as you, well, that's a boundary crossing, and then he runs away, which then there's the rest of the story. But the sense of permission giving for people to ask for help in caring for a loved one, to maintain the dignity of those relationships, of those family relationships. So that's how, those are just additional texts for you to explore in the Talmud about how we can perhaps honor and maintain relationships amidst these changes and the stresses of teaching.
Thank you, Michelle. This is a real victory. You invited me up here, and I'm going to go home with these great sources. Thank you. Yeah. Well, to what degree we fulfill Kibud Avam? Yeah. Oh, that's gorgeous. Yeah. Look, I think the win of this sermon is if I don't sort of rupture my relationship with my own parents and brothers, and that I have sort of in my kahal on the holidays, the congregation actually reflects sort of a generation of my age, and a generation of my parents' age in their late 70s, 80s and beyond. And I think that how amazing would that be to create sort of a congregational moment where we have sort of opened up a conversation to talk about this intergenerational moment. I think that there's a there that could be very, it's not just therapeutic for me, but you know, community building for the people I serve. And I'll just end. I gave you a few Erev Rosh Hashanah sermons to give you tone. I was thinking about what to talk about for martyrology, and Mati Friedman has his book, Who by Fire. I don't know if that's sermon worthy, but maybe there's a full sermon in there, but maybe simply talking about his book this year if you need a good intro to something. And Yisker, I mentioned the Daniel Pink book, which a colleague of mine, a classmate and friend, Josh Heller, talked about, the recurrence of regret by Yinachem, whether it's a calf or Jonah, and the number of times it comes up, and then the transition and the lexical connection between Vayinachem as regret to Lenachem as comfort. And maybe that could be a meditation at Yisker. Yes.
Just on the subject of book recommendations, our colleague Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg has a book coming out, I think, next week called on Repentance and Repair. Is that right? Yeah. And I think I've read sections of it, as some of you probably have too. I think it's going to have a lot to offer us thinking about Shuva and things of the high holidays.
To Rini, to Mark, to Michael, to Rabbi Crane, to all of you, may we, as we say to each other, bring them close this high holidays. And it's been a privilege to spend this morning with everyone. Tim, you want the last word?
I just want to say thank you so much. It's so nice to see you again. Just a true story. Years ago, I was struggling with the sermon, and I had a dream that I saw Elliot at a party, and I asked him for some advice, and his advice was excellent. It really helped me with the sermon. And I wrote him the next day to thank him, and he was so humble. Really, I'm so grateful, and I think we will take all that we've learned from you today, and if we have any trouble, all we have to do is dream. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I want to take the opportunity to say my own thank you to Elliot for coming. You were my rabbi for a time and still my teacher, and it's so great to see you. And we miss you here. So thank you for coming back. In a few moments, we're going to have 2 breakout sessions. And if you have to leave, we understand, but please take a lunch. And let's be back in about 6 minutes. Let's make it 5. The clergy team from Temple Sholem is going to be here with people talking about creating an arc of meaning throughout the holidays. And Rabbi Kenneth Berger is going to look at some poetry of Dan Pius, Hebrew poetry, with us on the other side of the divider. So, Nisia Tova to you, Elliot, and thank you so much.
You will hear from me, and thank you.
Well, hey, what's our part? You can have mine. No, or you can share mine. You can have mine. You can share. No. I actually had a wrong with it. Don't ever be. Just hold the class. Not just me. So you're like, oh, I have exactly. I have a president, I have a board of directors, and they deal with it. Whatever I say goes, and that's it. That's why they self-help. Yeah, self-help. We're legally a not-for-profit.
Hi, if you want to come on and tell me if you want to Zoom one of the breakout sessions. We're going to record them.
Sure that
Hi, Mark.
Yeah, I'm gonna sit in on Shoshana's and Sholom's.
Okay, I'm
I
gonna
can.
close. Okay, great. I'm gonna close this link and then restart it, so it'll be a separate video. So I'll restart it in like 2 minutes.
Rennie, I will come to a recording another time, but thank you so
Great.
much.
Welcome. Thanks.